Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Cinderella. She lived with her dad, her stepmother, and her 2 stepsisters. Now, most step families are lovely, kind people, but Cinderella's stepmother wasn't, and her stepsisters were absolutely horrid. One day, Cinderella's dad said, "I have to go away for a while. I will come home soon. Look after each other." But while he was hugging his wife goodbye, Cinderella's stepsisters were already pinching Cinderella and pulling her hair. They loved to boss her around. "Cinderella, wash my clothes. Cinderella, scrub my toilet. Cinderella, make me another glass of orange squash." Cinderella's clothes became dirty and tattered, and when she asked for new clothes, her stepmother only laughed at her, while her stepsisters had new dresses every week. One day, a smart man in a fancy coat came to the house with a long scroll. "On behalf of the prince, all the young single ladies in the kingdom are hereby invited to a great big party at the palace tomorrow night. Be there or be square." He looked at stepmother. "The prince is looking for a bride," he whispered with a wink. Cinderella's stepmother was very excited. That night, she dreamed of the jewels and dresses she could buy if one of her daughters became queen. Cinderella's stepsisters were very excited too. They both dreamed of being married to the very handsome prince and having servants and maids and cooks and cleaners, hundreds of people to boss around instead of just one. Cinderella just dreamed of getting out of the house for a couple of hours. The next day, Cinderella's stepsisters spent hours getting ready for the party. They caught Cinderella looking through her old dresses. "You don't think you'll be going to the party, do you?" they said, and they laughed and laughed. Cinderella went to her stepmother and begged her. "Please," she said, "I won't get in the way, I promise." Her stepmother thought about it for a moment, and then a cruel smile curled on her lips. "Of course you may go to the party, Cinderella, just as soon as you've finished your chores." Cinderella worked harder than ever. She even helped her stepsisters paint their horrible toenails on their huge stinky feet. When she was finished, she found an old pink dress and tried her best to fix some of the holes. She brushed her hair and scrubbed her face until she almost felt clean. "Time to go, daughters," called stepmother. "Don't you all look lovely?" Cinderella's heart skipped a beat. Her stepmother had never said anything so nice to her before, or called her daughter. Maybe things were going to change for the better. But then, stepmother said, Cinderella, haven't you forgotten something?" Cinderella looked herself up and down. "I don't think so, stepmother." "The kitchen?" Cinderella was confused. She most certainly had not forgotten to clean the kitchen. She'd polished the surfaces, scrubbed the floor, she'd even cleaned the stove and reorganised the pantry. She had left it all sparkling. Stepmother slowly pushed open the door, and Cinderella gasped. There was mess everywhere. A bag of flour had been knocked all over the floor. A pot looked like it had been left to boil over and had left a sticky pink mess all over the stove. Someone had made scrambled egg and left the pan for her to clean. That would be half an hour on its own. Cinderella's heart sank down to her toes. "Stepmother, perhaps I could finish this after the party," she said. "Absolutely not," her stepmother said cruelly. "We had an agreement, Cinderella." And with that, she hurried the 2 horrid stepsisters out of the house and off to the party. Cinderella was heartbroken. She just wanted to get out of the house and feel like a normal girl, just for a couple of hours. She started scrubbing the egg pan, and as she did, she started to cry. She closed her eyes and wished for a miracle. "Don't cry, Cindy," said a voice, and Cinderella turned to see a little old woman in a sparkling robe sitting on the table. The fairy godmother clicked her fingers, and the kitchen was spotless, even the egg pan. Cinderella just looked at her with her mouth open, but the magical old woman wasn't finished yet. She clicked her fingers again, and Cinderella's grubby old dress transformed into a gorgeous sparkly gown. On her feet were a pair of beautiful and unexpectedly comfortable glass slippers. Cinderella was amazed. She started to say thank you, but the fairy godmother said, "Oh, we haven't got time for all that. We've got to get you to the party." She looked around and said, "You don't happen to have any animals around here, do you?" The fairy godmother clicked her fingers once more, and they found themselves outside. 6 mice were lined up in front of a pumpkin. A horse was standing next to it, and a dog was waiting patiently at the back. Cinderella thought maybe the fairy godmother's magic had run out, or that maybe she herself was going a bit mad. But at another click of her fingers, the fairy godmother changed the mice into 6 horses, the horse into a driver, and the dog into a footman, and the pumpkin into the most beautiful golden carriage. Cinderella was stunned. "Now, Cindy, there's only one thing to remember. You must leave the party before midnight. Promise?" "Promise," said Cinderella, and she kissed the fairy godmother on the cheek before climbing into the carriage. When Cinderella arrived at the palace, she didn't want to waste any more time and hurried up the steps. The music was absolutely wicked, and Cinderella couldn't help but run to the dance floor and start throwing some wild shapes. The prince noticed her right away. All the other girls were standing around, too nervous to dance, but this girl could really move. He joined her, and the pair of them danced together all night. It was heaven. Cinderella saw her stepmother and sisters watching her, and she suddenly remembered the fairy godmother's warning. She checked the clock and saw it was almost midnight. "I've got to go!" she shouted, and she tried to give the prince her name, but the music was too loud and he couldn't hear her. She turned and ran from the dance floor in such a hurry that she left one of her glass slippers behind. She ran all the way home and went straight to bed, still dreaming of the prince and his amazing dance moves. The very next day, the fancy coat man was back with another scroll. "The prince would like to find and marry the girl in the sparkly dress with the radical dance moves," he announced. He didn't quite catch her name, but this is her shoe, and he held up the glass slipper she had dropped. Cinderella's sisters looked at each other for a moment, and then both shrieked, "It's mine! It's mine!" Cinderella watched as each sister tried on the shoe and tried not to laugh when their great big smelly feet simply would not fit. Cinderella said, "May I try?" Her stepmother was furious and tried to push her back into the kitchen, but the fancy coat man frowned at her and said, "All the young ladies must try the shoe, even the grubby ones." Cinderella slipped the shoe on with ease and smiled at the fancy coat man as she pulled the other one from her pocket. Cinderella's stepmother and sisters couldn't believe their eyes. "You!" they cried. But quickly they realised that they would still get to be part of the royal family and said, "Oh, Cinderella, how exciting! We can't wait for the royal wedding." Cinderella frowned and said, "Aren't you forgetting something?" Her stepmother and sisters stopped jumping up and down and said, "What?" "You'll have to finish your chores first," said Cinderella. And with that, she left the house and her stepmother and sisters and went off to marry the prince. And they lived happily ever after. What became of the stepmother and sisters, you ask? Well, after a while, Cinderella's dad came home from his travels, and he gave them a pretty serious telling off for being so horrid. After that day, they promised to be nice to everyone forever. And wouldn't you believe it? They actually were. Snow White. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago and far, far away, there was a kingdom. And in the kingdom, there was a young princess called Snow White. Snow White's mother had died when she was very young, and her father, the king, had gotten married again. The new queen had a secret magical mirror, and every day, just after breakfast, she would ask it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" You might think, oh, that's nice. She wanted to make sure she was the fairest, kindest, most just queen in the land. But unfortunately, you'd be wrong. Because fair doesn't just mean good and kind. She didn't care about that. Not one bit. Fair also means beautiful. And this was really all the new queen cared about. She wanted to be the most beautiful and most powerful ruler in the land. and she would stop at nothing to achieve this. Anyway, every day she asked the mirror who was the fairest, and every day the mirror replied, "My queen, my every word is true. The fairest one of all is you." She liked that. Years went by, and Snow White grew into a young woman, and much to the queen's annoyance, she became more and more beautiful. One morning, when the queen asked her mirror who was fairest, it replied, "My queen, my every word is right. The fairest one is young Snow White." At first, the queen was shocked, and then she became terribly angry. She couldn't bear being second best. Something would have to be done. The queen called for the royal huntsman and ordered him to take Snow White into the forest and get rid of her. The huntsman was very loyal to the queen, and he really wanted to do a good job. But unfortunately for the queen, he wasn't particularly bright. So he took Snow into the forest, just as the queen had asked, and he gave her a warm cloak and a packed lunch and sent her on her way, telling her never to return. Poor Snow White knew that the queen had never been particularly fond of her, but she didn't think she would resort to this kind of treatment. Never mind, she thought. If I keep calm and do my best, I'm sure things will work out. Snow White was always saying clever things like that. She strolled through the forest and eventually came across a sweet little cottage, and, full of hope, she knocked on the door. There was no answer, but it was starting to get dark, and Snow White knew that she would need to find somewhere to rest for the night. So she gently pushed open the door and went inside. The cottage was tiny but tidy, with 7 little chairs and 7 little beds. Snow White was so tired that she lay down on one of the beds and fell fast asleep. She slept for a long time in the comfy little bed. She awoke when the sun came streaming onto her pillow to the delicious smell of bacon and eggs sizzling away in the kitchen. She sat up suddenly, feeling a little worried about who had come home to find her asleep in their bed. Would she be in trouble? She silently crept down the stairs and found that the little home was all hustle and bustle, with 7 little men cooking, setting the table and pouring cups of tea. As one, they looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Princess," one of them said. "We hope you slept well." Snow White didn't know what to think. They showed her to a seat and gave her a lovely steaming cup of tea and told her how rumours of her beauty had reached the forest, and as soon as they saw her, they knew it must be her. Snow was relieved to have found such wonderful friends, and they were pleased to welcome her into their little family, and by the time they'd finished their breakfast, they'd all decided that she would stay forever. Across the kingdom, the Queen had just finished her breakfast too. She went to her magical mirror and, thinking the huntsman had truly gotten rid of Snow White, waited to be named fairest one of all as before. But the mirror spoke the truth, as always, and named Snow White instead. In a rage, she went to the huntsman and screamed, "I told you to get rid of that pesky princess!" "I did," he said. "I took her into the woods and told her to never come back." "That's not what I meant," she shrieked. "I meant get rid of her forever, with your axe." "Oh," said the huntsman. "My bad." The Queen decided that if she wanted a job done properly, she would have to do it herself. So she disguised herself as a kindly-looking peddler woman and went off to find Snow White. It didn't take long to find her. She followed the sounds of cheerful singing and merry laughter that led straight to the dwarf's cottage. She waited until Snow White was alone and knocked on the door. The Queen's disguise fooled the trusting Snow White, who invited her in for a lovely cup of tea. Inside, the Queen offered Snow a beautifully shiny red apple. The fruit looked juicy and crunchy and sweet, and Snow White didn't want to be rude, so she took a huge bite. Straight away, she fell to the floor unconscious. The Queen cackled and fled, leaving the poisoned apple and Snow White on the ground where they fell. When the dwarfs came home, they found Snow White lying still and cold. They were heartbroken and placed her on a comfortable bed with a glass cover over the top so they could always look upon her beautiful face, and they could keep watch over her day and night as days turned to weeks and then to months. After a while, a handsome prince who had heard tales of Snow White's beauty came to the kingdom. When he saw her lying unmoving in the glass case, he was devastated and started to cry. The dwarfs took pity on him and invited him inside to rest a while. They told him the story of how they found Snow White lying unconscious on the floor and how there was a beautiful apple just next to her. They told him how strange it was that all these months later, the apple hadn't rotted away. It looked just as juicy and delicious as it did the day Snow White took the fateful bite. The prince took one look at the apple and knew straight away that it was magical and that there could be hope for Snow White. He rushed outside, lifted the glass cover and gently opened her mouth and saw that the bite of apple was still stuck in her throat. The prince was very clever and very sensible, and he knew first aid. So, with a few pats on the back, the piece of apple came flying out of Snow White's mouth, and straight away she woke up to find all of her beloved dwarfs and the handsome prince all crowded around her. Everyone was overjoyed. Everyone, that is, apart from the Queen. After months of being deemed the fairest again by the mirror, Snow White's rescue from her magical sleep meant the mirror named her as the most beautiful in the kingdom once more. Consumed by her jealousy, the Queen tried to brew a magical potion to make her become even more beautiful. But she got the ingredients wrong, and instead of becoming more beautiful, she actually turned herself into a toad. Horrified, she jumped into a river and was never seen again. Snow White and the prince returned to the castle and were married the very next day, surrounded by their very best friends, the 7 dwarfs. And they all lived happily ever after. The Ugly Duckling. Once upon a time, there was a handsome prince who lived in a vast kingdom. He was searching for a princess to marry, as was the law at the time, but he was finding it very tricky indeed. There were many women in the kingdom who thought marrying a prince sounded rather nice, and so they would come to the palace in their finest clothes and jewels to try their luck. But it always turned out that they weren't real princesses, just pretending, so they could live in a palace and have servants and maids, not to mention the appeal of marrying the extremely handsome prince. This went on for such a long time that the prince had almost given up the idea of ever finding love, let alone getting married. Until one stormy night, everything changed. The wind was howling and the rain was dashing down on the palace. Lightning flashed and thunder crashed through the skies. The prince and his parents, the king and queen, were safe inside, keeping warm by the fire. Above the rumble of thunder and the ferocious wind, they heard a loud bang at the palace door. They heaved open the door to find a cloaked figure, soaking wet and shivering on the doorstep, their hood pulled low to conceal their face. "Who are you?" asked the prince. The figure pulled back the hood to reveal a beautiful woman with flowing black hair and deep brown eyes. "I'm a princess. I was passing by your palace when I got caught in the storm," she replied. "May I shelter here until it's safe to continue my journey?" The prince was utterly taken by her beauty and grace and immediately said, "Of course." The king and queen glanced at each other suspiciously. Another woman trying her luck, they thought. We must be careful. We couldn't bear for him to be tricked. The queen showed the woman to a guest bedroom and instructed her servants to draw a hot bath and fetch some warm, dry clothes for the so-called princess. "Just relax, and when you're ready, you may come to the dining room for a hot meal." The woman was very grateful and thanked the queen for her kindness. While the woman bathed and dressed, the queen instructed her servants again. "If that is a real princess, she will have lived in luxury her whole life. every blanket will have been the softest wool, every pillow the plushest feathers, and her bed will have been like sleeping on a cloud. You must fetch 20 of the most comfortable mattresses in the palace and stack them one on top of the other, and underneath them all you will place one hard little pea. Then we shall know if she truly is who she claims to be." Sitting around the table that evening while they enjoyed a decadent meal, the prince and princess chatted away as if they'd known one another for years. They laughed and joked, and the king and queen exchanged a hopeful look. If she really was a princess, then their beloved son would not only have a wife and one day a queen, but he could truly be happy and in love. After the meal, the princess yawned and excused herself to go to bed. She said goodnight to her generous hosts and climbed the stairs up to her room. When she opened the door, she was shocked to see the bed reaching almost to the ceiling, with a ladder stretching to the top for her to climb. Exhaustedly, she climbed to the top and flopped down among the blankets and pillows, sure that she would sleep like a baby, especially with the ache of her tired muscles and the delicious meal filling her belly. Downstairs, the Queen told the prince about the test she had set for the princess. "Mother," he said, "what a cruel trick! The poor princess must be exhausted, and now she will be tossing and turning all night, unable to get comfortable." "We shall see," the Queen said. The prince lay awake all night thinking about the woman, hoping that she would pass the test. This incredible woman who had just appeared in his life like magic and was just utterly perfect for him. He didn't want to be lonely anymore, and even more, he wanted to be not lonely with her. Finally, morning came, and the woman joined the king, queen, and prince for breakfast. Over their bacon and eggs, the queen asked casually, "How did you sleep, dear?" The princess responded politely, "Very well, thank you, your majesty." The prince's face fell in disappointment. The queen met his eye and shook her head sadly. The prince looked at the beautiful young woman beside him, and he decided there and then that this ridiculous law that says a prince must only marry a princess was old-fashioned and snobby, and he must demand that it be changed immediately. He took a deep breath and was about to get to his feet to tell the king and queen exactly how he felt about the whole thing, when the princess spoke again. "Well, there was one thing." He looked at her with hope blazing in his eyes, and she shifted nervously in her seat. "I would hate to be rude or ungrateful, but I must make you aware, in case other royals use that room when they come to stay. There was a tiny little bump in the bed." The prince jumped to his feet in pure joy, and the queen clapped her hands together with glee. All she had ever wanted was for her son to be happy, and now her dream could come true. The king leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. The princess stared at the three of them, confused. "So, the uncomfortable bed is a good thing?" Yes, it's wonderful," said the queen. "It's the best news I've ever heard," the prince said. The princess was relieved that they didn't think she was terribly rude, especially the prince, whom she had come to like very much indeed. She liked him so much, she didn't really want to leave. "Would you like to stay a little longer, princess?" the prince asked. "I would," she replied. "Only—" "We'll fix the bed right away," the queen assured her, and the princess smiled with relief. The princess did stay a little longer, and then a lot longer. And then they invited her father and mother, the king and queen of a faraway land, to visit. And after watching them together, they all agreed that the prince and princess were absolutely perfect for each other, and that they should stop wasting their time and just get married already. The wedding was the happiest day either of their two kingdoms had ever known, and the prince and princess danced long into the night, even after everyone else had gone home. They lived long and happy lives together, and they made sure that the silly law was changed, so that their sons and daughters could marry whoever they liked. Whether they were a prince, a princess, a baker or a bin man, they would marry for love, and that was that. and they all lived happily ever after. Beauty and the Beast. Once upon a time, there was a wealthy merchant who lived with his 3 daughters. The eldest 2 were as vain as they were fussy. They were never satisfied with what they had, always demanding fancy new dresses, sparkling jewellery, and enough perfume to make a skunk faint. But the youngest daughter, who everyone called Beauty, was the opposite. Beauty didn't need jewels or fine clothes to be happy. Give her a good book and a sunny spot to read, and she was in heaven. The merchant adored all his daughters, but secretly, Beauty was his favourite. She was kind, hard-working, and never complained, unlike her sisters, who thought chores were some kind of punishment invented to ruin their lives. One day, the merchant got some terrible news. His ships, loaded with the valuable goods he was to sell, had sunk in a storm. He'd lost everything. The family had to sell their fancy house in town and move to a little cottage in the countryside. But Beauty didn't mind. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work tending the garden and milking the goats. Her sisters, on the other hand, spent most of their time whining and staring at themselves in the mirror. Months passed, and just as the family began to get used to their situation, the merchant got a letter. One of his ships had survived. "I must go to the city and see if I can sell the cargo," the merchant told his daughters. "Perhaps we can return to our old life." The sisters immediately started listing all the things they wanted: silk dresses, diamond rings, and fancy hats. Beauty simply said, "Bring me a single rose, father. That's all I want." On his way home from the city, the merchant was caught in a terrible storm and had no choice but to shelter in an ominous-looking castle, covered in spiked turrets and gargoyles. The castle was strange, to say the least. The looming wooden doors creaked open as if by magic at his approach, and the table inside was set with a magnificent feast, though no matter how much he called out, no one seemed to be around. "Hello?" the merchant called again and again. Silence. Shrugging, he decided not to waste a good meal. He ate, rested, and prepared to leave the next morning. At sunrise, the merchant snuck back out of the castle, and on his way out, he walked through a rose garden, and in the centre, on a small bush, he saw the most perfect rose that had ever existed. Remembering Beauty's request, he reached out and plucked it from the bush. A fearsome roar boomed through the garden. Thundering from the castle on clawed feet appeared a beast, a massive, fur-covered creature with piercing blue eyes. "How dare you steal from me?" the beast growled. The merchant dropped the rose, trembling. I'm sorry, I meant no harm. It was for my daughter." The beast glared at him. "Then she will take your place." The merchant begged and pleaded. He said he would stay and there was no need for Beauty to come to this terrible place. But the beast would not budge. The merchant would have no choice in the end, because Beauty was so desperately worried about her father that she went out looking for him, and she was caught in a storm and took shelter in the castle. The merchant tried to tell her to leave before the beast saw her, but it was no use. The beast told the merchant to go home and care for his other daughters, and the merchant simply could not refuse. And so, Beauty stayed. Beauty expected the beast to be, well, terrifying, but he surprised her. He certainly looked very scary, with his sharp teeth and growly voice, but he didn't harm her. Instead, he gave her her own room, a wardrobe full of lovely clothes, and a library so big it made her gasp. "I hope you'll be comfortable here," the beast said one evening, his voice softer than she'd expected. "Thank you," Beauty replied, still wary. Over time, Beauty started to see past the beast's frightening appearance. He was kind, thoughtful, and even funny in a gruff, awkward sort of way. She noticed how warm he was with his staff in the castle, and how much they appeared to love him, despite his sometimes grisly demeanour. Every evening they dined together, and every evening the beast would ask, "Beauty, will you marry me?" And every evening Beauty would smile politely and say, "I'm sorry, beast, I can't." The beast never got angry. He would just nod sadly and say, "I understand." One day, Beauty found the beast looking gloomier than usual. "What's wrong?" she asked. "I can see you miss your family terribly," he said. "You should visit them. Take this magic ring. It will bring you back here when you're ready." Beauty was amazed. She never thought she would see them again, and she certainly didn't think the beast would trust her enough to go home and then come back again. She thanked the beast and used the ring to return home, despite a niggling feeling in her chest that pulled tighter and tighter the further she journeyed from the beast. When she returned home, her family was overjoyed to see her, though her sisters were more interested in her fancy clothes than anything else. "How did you escape the beast?" one sister asked. "It's not like that," Beauty said, not sure why she was so keen to defend the beast. "He's not as bad as you think." The sisters exchanged a look. "She's really lost it," the other whispered. Days turned into weeks, and the tightness in Beauty's chest only grew. She finally realised that she desperately missed the beast. One night, she woke with a start. She had dreamed of the beast, that he was terribly ill, lying in the rose garden, weak. He looked as though he were dying. She jumped to her feet and packed her bag. "I have to go back," she declared, and rushed from the cottage. Using the magic ring, Beauty returned to the castle as fast as she could. Sure enough, she found the beast collapsed in the garden, barely breathing. "I'm so sorry," she cried, kneeling beside him and stroking the fur on his face. "I should have come back sooner." The beast opened his eyes. "I thought you didn't care," he whispered. Beauty felt like her heart would burst. How could he think such a thing? "I do care," Beauty said, tears streaming down her face. "I love you." The moment she said those words, a bright light surrounded the beast. Beauty shielded her eyes, and when the light faded, the beast was gone. In his place, a handsome prince was now laying in her arms. "What? What happened? Who are you?" Beauty stammered. The prince smiled. "You broke the curse. A wicked fairy turned me into a beast, and only true love could set me free." Beauty blinked. "Wait, you were the beast?" "It's still me," he said gently, and Beauty looked deep into his blue eyes and saw it truly was her beast. Now, her prince. "Well," she said with a small smile, "I guess you clean up pretty well." The prince asked Beauty to marry him one last time, and this time she said yes. The merchant and Beauty's sisters moved to the castle, and rather than staying spoilt and bossy, they rose to the challenge of becoming royals and found they could behave with grace and decorum after all. And it certainly helped that their brother-in-law, the prince, somehow retained his deep, grumbling growl. And they all lived happily ever after. The Little Mermaid. This story begins with a secret. Not just any secret, but a secret world, hidden from memory in the depths of the ocean. Beyond the strange fish and dangerous floating lights of the midnight deep, beyond the underwater volcanoes and beyond the shipwrecks, further still, there is a kingdom, full of bright and beautiful creatures. The most beautiful of all of them were the merfolk. Mermen and mermaids, whose heads, shoulders, arms and chests were just like yours and mine. But where our bodies become legs, the merfolk had tails. Long, flowing, elegant tails with sparkling scales and silken fins that allowed them to glide gracefully through the water, or if they so chose, power through the water, faster than a sailfish. These magical creatures were ruled by a kind and strong king who lived in a great underwater palace with his 5 daughters. They lived happy and free, and they wanted for nothing. It was a perfect world, untouched by greed or pollution or war. The merfolk had never even heard of such things. There was just one rule that the merfolk all obeyed. Never, never go to the surface. The king would not allow it, for he knew the dangers that lurked up there. This was an easy rule to follow, as there was no good reason to go there. The merfolk had everything they needed. There was one mermaid, though. One mermaid who was a little more curious, a little more adventurous, a little more headstrong than the others. The Little Mermaid. She just happened to also be the king's youngest daughter. From just a mere child, the Little Mermaid had always liked to explore the furthest reaches of the kingdom, places she knew she shouldn't go, but she just couldn't help it. Something inside her told her there was more, and she had to know. And as she grew older and discovered more, she found that the more questions that were answered, the more she had to ask. On the day our story really begins, the Little Mermaid decided she could wait no longer. So she snuck out of the palace and away from the kingdom and up, 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 until her head broke the sparkling surface of the ocean, and she finally breathed fresh air, saw the sky, heard the birds. Her senses were alive, and it was incredible. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her, and, panicking, she dived back under the water as a huge ship came crashing through the waves. Full of more questions, she followed it and climbed up the side to see what she could see. It was full of humans, playing jolly music, dancing, singing, celebrating something. And among them, a handsome prince. She looked into his kind eyes, and the Little Mermaid fell in love, hook, line and sinker. There was no going back down to the Mer Kingdom now. She knew that if she went home, she would never see him again, and her heart would be empty forever. Just then, a storm started to swell, and the waves grew as vast as mountains. Lightning cracked open the sky, and thunder boomed. The wind and spray and waves tossed the ship this way and that, and the ship could not take it. As the ship disappeared beneath the waves, the Little Mermaid searched the lifeboats and the wreckage for the prince, rescuing many sailors as she looked, pushing them towards floating planks or lifeboats, the chaos around them so great they did not notice her scales or long tail. Finally, she spied him, clinging to a barrel that was slowly sinking beneath the waves. She rescued him, taking him to shore and caring for him until a search party came to take him home. He was barely conscious, with enough energy to ask her, "Who are you?" before she dove back beneath the waves to hurry home before she was discovered missing. She tried to go back to her normal life, she truly did, but she couldn't stop thinking about the prince. There was one creature in the kingdom, just one, who might be able to help her, and she knew the dangers, but she sought her out anyway. The Sea Witch. She was beautiful and terrible, with purple eyes and golden teeth. The merfolk knew she could perform great magic, but always at a great price. The Little Mermaid told the Sea Witch everything, and the Sea Witch told her she could help. The witch would give the Little Mermaid legs for 3 days, during which she must get the prince to fall in love with her. If she succeeded, she would stay human for the rest of her days. If she failed, the Sea Witch would keep the Little Mermaid in her cave for all eternity. All she requested in payment was the Little Mermaid's voice. The Little Mermaid could see no other way and couldn't bear a life without the prince, so she said yes, and the dreaded deal was done. "One more thing," the Sea Witch said. "If you touch seawater in the next 3 days, the spell will be broken, and you will turn back into a mermaid. No seawater," she reminded her. The Sea Witch gave the Little Mermaid a potion to drink, which made her fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. She awoke on the beach dressed in human clothes, and under her skirts she found she had legs. Real human legs. She had just about gotten the hang of walking when the prince came walking down the beach. He had walked the beach constantly since his rescue, desperate to find the one who had saved him. The prince took her back to the palace, believing her to be a runaway or lost. She tried to tell him it was her who rescued him from the shipwreck, but without her voice, she could not. He gave her a pen and paper so she could explain where she came from, but it was no use. Mer language was different to human language, and he could not make head nor tail of the squiggles and lines she drew. As time went by, though, it seemed that the Little Mermaid and the prince might just fall in love anyway. But, out of the blue, a woman appeared, claiming to be the one who rescued the prince from the ship, and quickly they seemed to be in love instead. The Little Mermaid was heartbroken. How could this happen? What could she do? She watched the prince and this mysterious woman together and tried to understand how this could be. when suddenly she saw a flash of purple in the woman's eyes and a spark of gold in her smile, and the Little Mermaid knew it was the Sea Witch in disguise. She knew what she must do. She filled a wooden bucket with seawater, careful not to let a single drop touch her skin, and she threw it with all her might at the Sea Witch. The spell that made the Sea Witch human was instantly broken, as was the spell that made the prince love her, and enraged, the Sea Witch dived back into the sea. The prince looked at the Little Mermaid, and in that moment, everything became clear. She was the one he had been searching for. She had rescued him, and she had been right in front of him all this time. It was her that he really loved. And as that realization hit him, they both glowed with love, and the spell on the Little Mermaid was broken. She could speak again, and she was to stay a human forever. They were married that very day, and they lived very, very happily ever after. The Princess and the Dragon. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful princess named Betty. She lived in the highest tower of a scary castle on a rocky island in the middle of a stormy sea, all alone. Alone, that is, apart from a huge dragon who guarded the island day and night and never let another person set foot on it. Back on the mainland, the townspeople all agreed that someone should go and rescue her. Many brave people said they would go, but at the last minute there would always be some excuse. Darren's guinea pig was poorly and he needed to take it to the vet. Jonathan's dad needed some help fixing a door and it simply couldn't wait. Simon had a tummy ache. And so years went by and the princess remained on the island. You may wonder what she got up to for all of those years. Well, at first she was very sad and lonely. She would spend many long hours looking out of her window of the high tower in the scary castle on the rocky island in the stormy sea. Out of the window she could see the huge dragon. It was as big as a house, and it was green with purple spikes down its back. It had black beady eyes and a long snout. Its claws were as long and sharp as swords, and its teeth were like daggers. It had huge wings, bigger than a jumbo jet. Most frightening of all, it breathed huge, hot plumes of fire from its mouth, burning anything in its path to a crisp. Princess Betty would watch the dragon from her window, and it watched her right back. Sometimes she would lose sight of the dragon for a moment and think perhaps it had flown away. But then, suddenly, it would swoop past her window almost close enough to touch, and she would run and jump under her covers in fright. As time went by, the princess began to grow bored in her tower, and she found out that with a hairpin and a lot of patience, she was able to pick the lock, and she could leave the high tower. She explored the scary castle and found that it wasn't actually that scary, it was just a bit dusty and cobwebby. After she cleaned it up a bit and opened some windows, it was much nicer. And after she painted some colourful pictures on the walls, it was positively cheerful. Next, Princess Betty decided she could try exploring the island, although there was still the obvious dragon problem. The dragon always seemed to be watching her, and whenever she tried to leave the castle, it would chase her back in. She tried disguising herself as a bush so it wouldn't see her, or rolling in stinky mud so it wouldn't smell her, but the dragon could not be fooled, and it got so bad that as soon as she opened the big wooden castle door, the dragon would rush towards her and she would slam it closed again. And so, there the princess remained, sad and lonely, with no hope of ever getting home. Meanwhile, the people on the mainland were starting to get a little impatient. The mayor decided that if everyone claimed to be too busy to rescue the princess, then he would have to choose someone to go, whether they wanted to or not. All the young, strong people in the town wrote their names down on scraps of paper and threw them into a big empty cooking pot. Everyone gathered in the town square for the lucky or unlucky person to be chosen. The big moment came, and the mayor of the town pulled the scrap of paper from the pot and called out the name. "Steve," the mayor said. and young Steve was nudged forward. He smiled and waved at the townspeople, but inside he was terrified. He couldn't fight his way out of a wet paper bag. How on earth was he going to take on the dragon? The townspeople helped to prepare him by loading food, armour and weapons onto a rowing boat, and they pushed poor trembling Steve out to sea. All the while, the princess continued to wait in her tower. One day, she was sitting at her window, as she usually did, and she was watching the dragon, who was laying on the lawn with its head on the ground, resting between its sharp claws. The dragon was lazily watching her too. The princess sighed. The dragon sighed too. The princess sighed again, even more dramatically. The dragon sighed too, puffing a little cloud of smoke out of its nostrils. Wait a minute, thought the princess. Could it be? She sat up straight, and the dragon lifted its head to look at her. She tilted her head to the side, and she couldn't believe it when the dragon did the same. Princess Betty stood up and ran down the stairs of the high tower, through the castle, and heaved open the big wooden door. The dragon came racing towards her, making the ground shake with every thunderous step. Instead of slamming the door like she usually did, she stood her ground and closed her eyes, hoping she was right and that she wasn't about to become the dragon's lunch. Then the thundering steps stopped, and all she could feel was the hot breath on her face. She opened one eye, and there was the dragon in front of her, almost close enough to touch, laying on the ground like a dog. Princess Betty couldn't believe it. She took one careful step forwards and reached out one hand to gently stroke the dragon's nose, right between its nostrils. The dragon's tail started thumping the ground like a ginormous, scaly dog. "You poor thing," Princess Betty said. "All this time I've been so afraid of you. But you've been just as lonely as I have." She walked along beside the dragon, her hand gently stroking its scaly side. She stopped by its front leg and said, "May I?" The dragon huffed a friendly little puff of smoke from its nostrils and seemed to try to lay down flatter on the ground to allow her to climb aboard. The dragon beat its enormous wings and up they flew into the sky. Round and round the castle they flew and in and out of the clouds. The princess had never felt so free. Just as they were about to land again on the rocky island, Princess Betty spied a man on the beach next to a smashed-up rowing boat destroyed by the stormy sea. "We must try to help," she said. They landed next to the man, and Princess Betty said, "Are you quite all right? What are you doing here?" The young man looked like he was trying very hard to be brave. "I am Steve," he said. "I am here to rescue you, Princess." The princess looked at the young man and then at the dragon and raised one eyebrow. "It looks very much like you are the one in need of rescue, Steve." Steve laughed, and the princess laughed, and the dragon puffed a little cloud of smoke out of its nostrils. "Hop on," the princess said, and the three of them flew back to the mainland, where the princess assured all the townspeople that Steve had indeed been extraordinarily brave in rescuing her. What of the end of our story? Well, Princess Betty and Steve became best friends, and then, without really meaning to, they fell in love. They were married in the castle, which was now full of laughter and joy, and the dragon stayed with them for the rest of their days. And they all lived happily ever after. Rapunzel. Rapunzel. Once upon a time, there was a witch. She was selfish and mean and spiteful. She didn't like anyone or anything, and she especially didn't like cheerful, happy people. She didn't like it when they laughed or sang. She didn't like it when children played, and most of all, what she absolutely hated was people who were in love with each other. Happy couples, they were just the worst. The one thing the witch didn't hate was her garden. It was a lush green jungle of enormous and perfectly formed fruits and vegetables, surrounded by a high wall. Great spiralling towers of crisp, sweet runner beans, sprawling vines rich with pumpkins and cucumbers, trees overflowing with juicy apples and plums. The garden was her pride and joy, and she used her magic to pull all the goodness from the soil for miles around to magically ripen the food and make it plump and delicious. Near to the witch lived a young couple. They had a garden of their own and worked hard to tend to it, but the witch's magic was draining their land of every bit of nourishment, and they could barely grow a bean. The man begged the witch for help, but she would not share, even though she had far more than she could ever eat alone. So one night, the man climbed the wall to steal a single juicy lettuce, his wife's favourite. But as he plucked the lettuce from the ground, a bolt of lightning lit the garden, and the witch stood before him with a thunderous look on her face. "You would steal from me!" she roared. He fell to his knees and begged for help. The witch thought for a moment and said, "Fine. You may take as much food as you need from the garden, but nothing in this world comes for free. In return for saving your life, you will promise me your firstborn child." The man quickly agreed before snatching the lettuce and running home to his wife. He knew they needed the food, and he would worry about the promise later. Well, later came sooner than he thought, and before long, the woman had a beautiful golden-haired baby girl, and they named her Rapunzel. They were so happy, and the man thought his promise to the witch had been forgotten. But no sooner than the baby turned 1, the witch stole her away in the night and locked her up in a tall tower. Rapunzel's life was boring. She had little to do. She drew, she read books, she even learned to cook, but most of all, she liked to sing. Of course, the witch hated it, so Rapunzel made sure she only sang while the witch was away, which was most of the time. One day, a prince passed by the tower. He heard sweet singing and stopped to find where it came from. Spying the tower, he tried to find the door, but couldn't. He tried to climb the tower, but couldn't. He could see the window at the top and knew that the source of the beautiful music was inside, so he stayed and listened a while. He watched, hidden, as the witch returned and the singing stopped. The witch called out, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair!" and a braid of gleaming golden hair tumbled from the window. The witch grabbed hold and was raised up to the window and disappeared inside. The prince watched and waited for the witch to leave again. Straight away he went to the bottom of the tower and called out the words, and the golden rope of hair was once again tossed to the ground. His heart beating in anticipation, he climbed to the top and came face to face with Rapunzel. She was shocked. No one but the witch had ever climbed her hair to the tower. But she looked into the eyes of the prince and saw the kindness and the hope there, and she dared to dream of freedom and happiness. The prince looked into Rapunzel's eyes, and he knew his life would never be complete without her by his side. For a whole year the prince would visit Rapunzel in her tower. He would tell stories of the world that he had explored, and she would sing for him. He even taught her some new songs from distant lands. She told him how eating from the witch's magical garden her whole life had made her magical hair so long and so strong. But the prince never stayed long, for fear that the witch would find out and hurt him, or even worse, punish Rapunzel. One day, he watched the witch leave as usual and quickly called to Rapunzel to bring him up. He was excited to show her a gift he had made her. It was a rope ladder he had painstakingly made over the year he had fallen in love with her. He had started making it the day they met, and he'd been adding to the length every day until finally it was long enough to reach the ground from her window. Rapunzel was so happy. They decided they would escape together the very next day. Rapunzel couldn't help but sing and dance around her room all that day, and in her happiness she forgot the time, and the witch returned. The witch heard Rapunzel singing a song from a kingdom far away, and knew right away that it was a song she would have no way of knowing, should never have heard before. She flew into a rage and cut Rapunzel's hair. She used the severed golden braid to bring them both to the ground, and she dragged Rapunzel away. The witch took Rapunzel to a distant wasteland, and left her there alone, telling her never to return or she would kill the prince. In all of her years in the tower, Rapunzel had become part of the magical garden, and without her, it turned sour. The fruit and vegetables rotted away, and the plants turned to thorns and nettles. The prince saw this and knew straight away that something was wrong. He climbed the magical hair that remained hanging from the window, wanting to help Rapunzel. As he reached the top, he came face to face not with his beloved, but with the witch. She cut the braid, and the prince went tumbling down, scratching his eyes on the thorns and becoming blind. The prince wandered through the land, listening out for Rapunzel's song, and Rapunzel wandered through the wasteland searching for her prince. The witch returned to her garden and found that no matter what she did, she could not return it to the paradise it once was. She used up all of her magic to fight back the thorns until she shriveled into a little grey worm and burrowed into the ground, never to be seen again. Rapunzel and the prince wandered for a year, until finally the prince heard the familiar, beautiful singing that he loved so much. He stumbled towards the sound, calling Rapunzel's name, and fell into her arms. Her tears of happiness fell freely onto his face, and the last seed of magic from the garden fell with them, instantly healing his sight. Together, they returned to the garden, where they found happiness like no other. The garden felt its beloved Rapunzel return, and it became lush and fertile again. They knocked the tower to the ground and built a cottage, where they spent the rest of their days, singing and dancing to their heart's content. The Frog Prince. Once upon a time, there was a princess who lived in a grand kingdom. She was a little bit spoiled and a little bit selfish, and she would spend all day playing in the gardens with her fancy toys instead of learning about the running of the kingdom like she should. Her father, the king, was just and kind and loved by all of his subjects. He was starting to worry that when the time came for his daughter to become queen, she would be a bit, well, rubbish, and she would undo all of his hard work, making the kingdom so brilliant. But what could he do? One day, the princess was playing as usual in the gardens with a new golden ball. She would throw it in the air and catch it, and then throw it and catch it and throw it and catch it again. It wasn't a very exciting game, but she spent a lot of time on her own, so she didn't mind. She threw the ball higher and higher, catching it every time, until one throw was just a little too high, and the ball slipped through her hands when she tried to catch it, and it came tumbling down onto the grass and then bounced away down a slope. "No!" she shouted as the ball bounced right into the pond with a neat little splosh. She flopped down by the pond crossly. "What will I do now? I'll be in such trouble. This is the 9th golden ball I've lost this month." A loud ribbit from just beside her nearly made her jump out of her skin. "Goodness!" she exclaimed. "What on earth was that?" "It was me," a little voice said. The princess looked all around until she saw a slimy little creature with long jumpy legs and 2 big googly eyes sitting atop a lily pad. "Ugh!" she shrieked. "A disgusting little toad!" "Actually, I'm a frog," said the frog, thoroughly offended. "I was going to help you find your golden ball, and all I would ask in return is that you let me stay with you in the palace for a while. 3 days to be exact." The princess recoiled and said, "No way! You are slimy and yucky, and I don't want to touch you, let alone take you home with me." "Ah, well," said the frog, "never mind," and he hopped into the pond with a plop. "Wait!" called the princess, realising she would never get her golden ball back without him. The frog's eyes appeared just above the waterline, narrowed on her, waiting for what she had to say. "Fine," she sighed. 3 days and no more." "Deal," the frog said, and he disappeared under the water once more. In 1 second flat, her golden ball came flying out of the water towards her, and she caught it in one hand. And then that naughty princess turned and ran back up to the palace as fast as she could go. She never had any intention of taking the frog home at all. Out of breath and a little muddy, the princess slammed her bedroom door behind her and leant back on it, relieved. Thank goodness she didn't have to spend another second with that disgusting little amphibian. Suddenly, there was a booming knock on her door, and she nervously opened it. Standing in the doorway was her father, the king, with a thunderous look on his face. Sitting on his upturned palm was the frog, with an equally furious look on his face. "This frog tells me you broke a promise, daughter," the king said with a deep frown. "That is not behaviour befitting of a princess. In this kingdom, we keep our promises. Fulfill your promise properly, or I will make it a week." The princess looked at the frog with a scathing look. What a snitch! The frog gave her a smug smile. He had won this one, and he knew it. The king held out the frog and raised an eyebrow at the princess. She held out her palm, and the frog hopped wetly onto it. Splat! The princess nearly gagged, but with one look from the king, she quickly composed herself. And so the frog would stay. She made him a soft little bed out of a velvet cushion and a silk scarf and placed it on her nightstand. She made a little bath for him out of a silver jewellery box, and she gave him a solid gold saucer to eat from and a jewel-encrusted egg cup to drink. She was going to do this properly because there was no way this frog would be staying more than 3 days. Not 1 minute more. She carried him in her pocket and showed him all around the palace. The magnificent throne room, the majestic ballroom, the royal gallery, all the most impressive parts of her home. "What about the rest?" the frog asked. "The rest?" the princess repeated. "The rest? I've shown you all the most amazing parts of the palace. What more do you want?" "The rest," he shrugged. Finally, the princess understood. She showed him to the kitchens where the flour-covered cooks worked tirelessly to feed everyone, the stables and kennels where the stable boys cared for the horses and dogs. She introduced him to the maids, the butlers, the housekeepers, and the chimney sweeps. She even showed him outside the palace and took him to meet some of their royal subjects in the city outside. It turned out the frog was actually quite good company. He loved meeting everyone and chatted away to them all happily. He was kind and funny, and she started to watch him carefully and think about how maybe, just maybe, she could try to be a little more like him. At the end of the 3rd day, the frog thanked the princess and got ready to go back to the pond, a sad, faraway look in his eye. "I'll miss you," the princess told him nervously. "I've learned so much from you. You're so much better at all this than me. You'd make a much better ruler than I ever will. I wish you could stay." The frog beamed at this. "Thank you, princess," he said, and then he began to glow and glisten. "What is happening?" the princess said, stepping back in shock. "Long ago, I was cursed by a wicked witch," the frog said, as he started to float up into the air, surrounded by magic. "I was selfish and spoiled, and I demanded respect from people purely because of who I was. I didn't earn it." "Who you were?" she repeated. "The spell could only be broken when someone accepted me and respected me for who I am inside, regardless of who I used to be." "Who were you?" the princess asked. Finally, the blinding glow around the frog faded, and there before her was a handsome young man with a crown upon his head. "A prince," he said, smiling nervously at her. The princess couldn't believe her eyes. She took the prince straight away to see the king and tell him everything. The king was so pleased at the change in the princess and could see that it was all thanks to the prince. He decided that, if they wanted to, they could marry. And they did. The prince and princess became king and queen, and they ruled the kingdom, adored by all the royal subjects. And they lived very happily ever after. The end. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this magical story. If you want to come along on more of our adventures, make sure you subscribe to our channel. There's so much more to be discovered. You can start right now by clicking on our channel and picking your next favourite tale. There really is something for everyone, from daring heroes and mischievous creatures to magical lands and secret wonders. And remember, by subscribing, you'll be the first to know when a brand new story is ready to be enjoyed. Let's go.